we continue into lesson 2 or into chapter 2, we are looking at different ways to solve quadratic equations. Okay, so like in lesson 2-3, we solved using factoring. Where we would factor the equation and set each factor equal to 0. And that's kind of our go-to method. Like that's always what I'm going to encourage you is can you factor the equation? Now, not everything can factor, so we've got to have some other methods, and that's what we're leading into today. So we're leading into completing the square. We'll get to completing the square in a little bit, but we're going to use some other ideas here. So, as we look at the first one, 4x squared plus 10 equals 46. Thoughts on way to solve that? Okay. If we subtract the 10, now what do we end up with? 4x squared equals 36. Now what? We could do either or at this point. I would encourage you to go a step farther and divide by 4. Get the x squared by itself. So I would agree to divide by 4. And then we have x squared equals 9.
Yes.
And?
3.
Okay. And this is similar to what I taught yesterday, isn't it?
Yeah.
To where if it's x squared equals 9, we're going to take the square root. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 9?
Plus or minus 3.
If you want full credit, I would encourage you to put plus or minus 3. Some of us will count you wrong. I would give you partial credit. Okay, so options here. When you have just an x squared in an equation with numbers and you have no x's, the easiest thing to do is to isolate that x squared and then take the square root of both sides. Now, the difference between what I just did today and what we did yesterday, I got a square root of a positive value, didn't I? So it kind of makes life a little easier in a way. I got a square root of a positive. I'm not going to say you won't see i's today, but we will probably see positives also. Okay, thoughts on B?
Yeah.
Okay. One option is to distribute or FOIL. Okay. One option is to distribute or FOIL. So take x plus 7 times x plus 7. FOIL it out. I'm going to take you a different route. Okay. So you could possibly FOIL this out and then work to make your equation equal to 0 and see what happens. Now, based on looking at the answer, we wouldn't be able to factor it. Okay? I have a different route I'm going to take us. X plus 7 quantity squared. Because it is quantity squared, is what I would call a perfect square. Okay? And so if x plus 7 squared is a perfect square, 25 happens to be a perfect square as well, doesn't it? I'm going to suggest, because we have this parentheses squared, that we use the same technique and take the square root of both sides. Okay, so follow along. If I take the square root of the left, we're going to take the square root of the right. Yes? Okay. Square root of x plus 7 quantity squared. What do we think? What happens when you square root a perfect square?
Take away the square.
Okay. The square root and the square will undo each other, cancel each other out, and I'm left with x plus 7. Okay, so by taking the square root, we got rid of the square. On the right, we're going to have, and we'll simplify this here in a moment, the square root of negative 25. What do I need to not forget?
Your I.
We'll talk I in the next step. Plus or minus. Okay. So we've got a plus or minus there. Because, what have I been saying? When you take the square root in an equation situation, you have to account for both possibilities. Now, what is the square root of negative 25?
5. Plus or minus 5.
5i. Remember, guys, it's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. The square root of negative 1 is I. The square root of 25 is 5. Right?
Yep.
Okay. Now, am I done? Have I solved for x here? No. How do I get x by itself? Yeah, if it's plus 7, we're going to subtract 7. Now, how I would encourage you to write your answer. We are subtracting 7. It's kind of weird to say plus or minus 5i minus 7. Okay? Generally more common is to put a plus or minus in the middle of two things. And if I put it in the middle of two things, that means I'm going to put this subtracting 7 out front and say negative 7 plus or minus 5i. Okay? And I boxed it without thinking to ask, am I done?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm done because I can't add a real number and an imaginary number. So we leave it as that. Now, notice, how many answers am I getting on all these problems? Plus or minus 3 would mean positive 3 and negative 3. So that's 2 answers, right?
Yeah.
Negative 7 plus or minus 5i.
2.
2 because it's negative 7 plus 5i and negative 7 minus 5i. Okay, so we're always going to be looking for 2 answers when we're solving these quadratic equations. I have x squared. We're thinking in terms of taking the square root of both sides today. That's kind of our goal here. Now, C. What do you see as options on C?
Minus 30.
It's big hole, not
Big hole.
You're knocking.
Yeah, I didn't want to.
We're tossing car keys around. Okay.
Those are more than carbon.
That's a problem.
Okay. On C, what is one option? You guys are probably going to give me the option I'm not going to go for, but
Subtract 36. That's the one she's not going to go for. Nope.
I wouldn't subtract the 36 in any scenario. I
Subtract
don't
the
think.
81.
Okay, so, okay, here's the deal. I'm not going to do either of these subtracting options. Now, I will say subtracting 81 and making the equation equal to 0 would give you a direction to go. It would work. Okay, it takes us back to lesson 2-3 where we could then factor it. Now, I'm teaching a new plan. And again, I'm trying to lead us into completing the square that we're going to do later. Okay? I'm going to take my x squared plus 12x plus 36, and I'm going to factor it as is. Because I personally know something about x squared plus 12x plus 36 that is special.
Okay.
So just follow along for a moment, okay? If we factor x squared plus 12x plus 36, what do you know about x squared? X and x. You should be able to come up with your numbers pretty easily. Multiplying to be 36. Wait. And adding to be 12. 6 and 6. And they multiply to be positive, add to be positive, so they're both positive. And this does still equal 81. The reason I went this direction is because that factored into 2 identical parentheses. X plus 6 times x plus 6 could be written as x plus 6 squared. Now, so the directions here are use square roots to solve. This is why. That left side, you wouldn't have necessarily recognized it, but that's what I'm trying to get you to recognize, was a perfect square. When you can factor into a perfect square, we can factor it, And then what am I going to suggest we do at this point?
Square.
Square root, yes. If I have x plus 6 squared, if I have parentheses squared, you always have that option of taking a square root. If I square root the left, we square root the right. Now, what is the square root of x plus 6 squared? X plus 6. What is the square root of 81? I heard it over there somewhere.
Plus or minus.
Plus or minus 9, because we're in an equation situation, yes?
Yes.
Okay. What do I do to solve? Okay. If it's x plus 6, we're going to subtract 6.
-6 plus or
Plus
minus.
or minus no one.
Okay. Savas is going to count you wrong right now.
Yay. You got, no, never mind.
Are you joking me right now?
What?
I was thinking exactly. You got,
We're not done.
I'm not done.
We're not done.
Do I have to swap for each?
Do you have to add -6 and plus minus 9?
In other words, okay, so up here I stopped because could I add a -7 and a 5i? Could I add a number and an I?
Oh.
No. Do I have an I here?
Nope.
No. Can I add a -6 and a 9? Or -6 and a -9?
So it's gonna be.
So you're still going to have two answers. Okay. We're going to be looking at -6 plus 9 and -6 minus 9. -6 plus 9 is
I don't know.
3.
3. -6 minus 9,
-15.
-15.
Except for
So we have two answers of 3 and -15. I'll be honest, I said Savas was going to count you wrong. I'm going to take off partial credit if you don't continue on the problem there. Okay? Okay. D?
Back.
X squared minus 16x plus 64 equals 7.
Perfect.
Does this left side look like it's going to factor into
Yes.
Yeah.
as a perfect square?
Yes.
Okay. And here's my clue. I don't know if you caught it over here, but the square root of 36 also added back up to be 12, didn't it? That's kind of a check there. Square root of 36 is 6. 6 plus 6 is 12. Am I going to be able to do the same thing here? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to factor this. X squared becomes x and x. What multiplies to be 64 and adds to be -16. Okay. It's 8 and 8 because they multiply to be a positive, same signs. They add to be a negative. Now, I personally wrote that out as x minus 8 times x minus 8 because I'm teaching. Could you have just skipped ahead to the step x minus 8 squared equals 7? If you see that, if you're comfortable with that. If not, do what I just did, right? Okay, x minus 8 squared equals 7. Okay, that left is a perfect square, x minus 8 squared, so we're going to square root. If we square root the left, we square root the right. What is the square root of x minus 8 squared? X minus 8. What is the square root of 7?
Or 20.
So I heard plus or minus. What is the square root of 7?
Where is that?
Square root of 7. Okay, it's a decimal answer. So we're going to leave it as is. If it's x minus 8, we're going to add 8. If I add 8 to plus or minus square root of 7, the best way to write this,
Plus minus square root.
Put your 8 first, and then plus or minus the square root of 7.
So should we stop it?
How are you?
Square root.
Okay, so do we stop here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's kind of like up here. 7 and 5i, they weren't like terms. 8 and square root of 7, they're not like terms. So we are stopping there. Okay? So these last two I did here, where we had to factor the left into a perfect square and then square root both sides. These are part of our steps of something called completing the square. Okay? And that's what we're going to look at next.
Are we gonna finish this lesson today?
I don't think so. That wasn't my plan.
Nice.
So we'll at least have the bottom of the back to do. Okay, so completing the square. I have a set of steps here for you. If you remember, I don't know how much you looked at your blue paper, but the same set of steps is on the blue paper. So your job right now is to know how to apply the steps, how to use the steps. I'm not even 100% forcing you to memorize it. Okay? The more you use it, the more it will get memorized. But, so, as we look at these steps, our job is to solve. Now, completing the square is something that will work when factoring doesn't work. Okay? So it has some other options, because here's factoring will always work. Step 1, we're just going to go through them steps. Rewrite the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c.
Subtract 6.
Okay, so one thing he's noticing is that if I need this to be x squared plus bx equals c, the 6 has to move to the other side, doesn't it? So we're going to take the plus 6 and we're going to subtract the 6. So then at that point, I have 3x squared minus 12x equals negative 6. Okay. And then, I didn't know if anyone could catch it or not. Notice, well, two things. First of all, if you see that everything divides by 3, will that make life better? It will. But also, in order to complete the square, it's necessary. This said, rewrite the equation by making it x squared plus bx equals c. It didn't say ax squared, did it? So that means what has to be the number in front of x squared?
That's 0.
Not 0, but
One.
invisible 1. So we are going to take this, everything divides by 3. So we're going to divide that a value away. Because it's an equation, I can divide both sides. I don't have to factor.
Sorry for the interruption. Maya Kaufman, please report to the middle school office. Maya Kaufman, please report to the middle school office.
3x squared divided by 3 is x squared minus 12x divided by 3 minus 4x. I'm going to leave a gap. Equals negative 6 divided by 3. Negative 2. I left that gap on purpose and I was trying to give you guys a hint. Okay? To leave a gap because upcoming step. Okay? So, that right there is step 1. Rewrite the equation in the form 1x squared plus bx equals c. Step 2. This is officially what completing the square is. Complete the square by adding b over 2 quantity squared to each side of the equation. Now, let's talk about what is b in my current equation. B in my current equation is negative 4, yes? With that in mind, it said to do b divided by 2 quantity squared. So that means I'm going to do negative 4 divided by 2 quantity squared. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 quantity squared is 4. Okay? So this right here is what b over 2 quantity squared is. That's 4. What did it tell us to do? We're going to add it to each side of the equation. So I said leave a gap, right?
Yeah.
We're going to take this 4 here and we're going to add it on the left and we're going to add it on the right. Sorry, I didn't quite leave the room there, but I needed to. Okay. That is step 2. Okay, we added it to both sides. We'll worry about cleanup in our next step. Step 3 is to factor the left side of the equation. X squared minus 4x plus 4, if you did that previous step right, will factor. X squared minus 4x plus 4. X squared breaks into x and x. What about numbers? 2 and 2? Multiplies before, adds before, and what did you start to say about signs? No? How about minus minus? Because they multiply to be a positive, I need them to be the same signs. Because they add to be a negative, they're both going to be negatives. And what is negative 2 plus 4 on the right? 2. What just so happens on that left side, guys? This is x minus 2 quantity squared. Okay? Are we getting the rest of our class?
It sounds like
It does.
that. It definitely is.
Yeah. Okay.
It sounds like
This was step 3. We factored the left. We get parentheses squared. Parentheses times parentheses becomes parentheses squared. Step 4. You probably already know what to do, but we're going to solve this now. If it's x minus 2 squared, what's our step? Square root. If I square root the left, we're going to square root the right. What is the square root of x minus 2 quantity squared? X minus 2. What is the square root of 2?
Square root 2.
In an equation setting, plus or minus the square root of 2. And then step 5 is just solve for x, which I think you kind of would know anyways at this point. But if it's x minus 2, we're going to add 2. If we add 2, how are we going to write this?
2 plus or minus square root.
Okay. I prefer to see you putting the plus or minus in the middle. So 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. Okay? So it looks similar to the type of problem we did above, isn't it? So as I said, the problems up above was kind of leading into this. We practiced taking square roots. We factored. Now we're doing the whole thing, completing the square. Okay? Could some of these problems be solved other ways? Yes, they could. But I'm going to tell you right now, this one, based on looking at this answer, you couldn't have just factored the original problem. It would not have factored. Okay? So you have to have another option than factoring. We'll talk about quadratic formula next week. That would be an option. But completing a square is also an option. Okay. Let's look at B. As we look at B, x squared minus 2x plus 3 equals 0. I'm going to tell you right now, guys, factoring's not an option here.
Nope.
Okay? You can't multiply to get a positive 3 and add to get a negative 2. The signs don't allow it. So, we're going to use our technique of rewriting, or to complete the square. Step 1 says to do what?
Subtract 3.
Because I want it to be 1x squared plus bx equals c. I need to make sure my c value is over on the other side. So we're going to subtract the 3. So then I have x squared minus 2x. I'm going to leave a gap. 0 minus 3 is negative 3. You don't have to leave a gap there. You can always just rewrite the step later, but if I leave the gap, I have a spot to put my number. Okay, that's step 1, yes? We already have 1x squared in this scenario, so I don't have to worry about that. Okay, step 2. What does step 2 tell me to do?
Divide your b by 2.
Okay, we've got to find our b divided by 2 quantity squared. So what is b?
Negative 2.
B is negative 2. So b divided by 2 squared. Negative 2 divided by 2 squared. Negative 2 divided by 2.
Negative 1.
Negative 1 squared.
Negative 1.
Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Now, what do I do with that b over 2 quantity squared value?
Plug it in. Plug it in.
Plug it in by adding it to
Both sides.
both sides. So in this gap I left, I'm going to put plus 1. At the end of the right side, I'm going to put plus 1. Okay. Are we good with step 2?
Yep.
Step 3. Back to the left side. X squared minus 2x plus 1. I'm going to give you a heads up, guys. It's always going to factor into 2 identical parentheses. Every single time. That is the whole design behind completing the square. It's going to factor into 2 identical parentheses. I'm still writing it out this way, though, because I think some people will do better if they see it this way, but you don't have to. X squared breaks into x and x. What multiplies to be 1 and adds to be negative 2? Negative 1, negative 1. I just thought, I usually teach this as a shortcut too. You can also just look at what's the square root of 1. And it's 1, isn't it? And then use the sign of the middle value. Would have worked over here as well. What's the square root of 4? 2, using that middle sign. So, okay. This equals, if you haven't already cleaned up that right, what is negative 3 plus 1? Negative 2. Okay. X minus 1 times x minus 1. If you didn't already write it, can be rewritten as x minus 1 squared equals negative 2. Okay, so we step 3, we factored. What's step 4? Square root, right? Now your job is to solve. Yes? Solve using square roots. So I'm going to square root. What is the square root of x minus 1 quantity squared? X minus 1, right? When you square root a square, you get what's under the radical or in the parentheses. Square root of negative 2. Plus or minus?
No, just 2. Square root of 2. Negative 2. 2i. Yeah, you're right. 2i.
Not exactly.
Oh.
So what's the square root of the negative? I. What's the square root of 2?
Negative square root of 2.
Square root of 2.
Square root of 2i.
You can't just say 2. So this is going to be I square roots of 2. When you guys were saying 2i, I was assuming you took the 2 out of the square root. Okay? But remember, this is square root of negative 1 times square root of 2. Yes, there's an I, but the square root of 2 we can't do, so we leave it under the radical, right? Okay. Officially, step 5 is solve. How am I going to solve for x? Yeah, if it's x minus 1, we're going to add 1. And so we get x equals 1 plus or minus I square roots of 2. And guess what? you're done, right?
No.
Okay.
No more.
We're done.
Well, I say,
I do.
we've got 5 minutes.
All done.
Now, Monday, we're gonna come back and practice a little more completing the square. You don't have anything to do right now, you wanna look at C and D, you can do that. I have one other thing to teach, and that is the bottom part of how to take a standard form equation into vertex form. Okay? 7 of you have the assignment turned in that's due today. You've got 5 minutes, that can get a little bit done. Okay? The new assignment is posted. So if you've already gotten the old assignment turned in, and you want to look at the new assignment, you can do some of the beginning problems. I think you're going to. Okay?